It's time to get educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. This is the Dr. Duke Show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show. Before we get started, please hit that share button so we can educate more patriots and parents around the country. All right, we're kicking things off with Vicki McKenna for CultureCast. And Vicki, you're one of the stars of our week. People like to sit down and listen to our conversation, so it's good to be with you again.
Oh, I'm super grateful. Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
And we have an interesting couple of conversations going on today. I think the first one is pretty damn serious. The second one, more laughable. Let's start in Elmbrook, Wisconsin. This is one of the more conservative suburbs of Milwaukee, right? This is not Madison. This is not deep in the heart of Milwaukee. This is a fairly conservative area of Wisconsin. Elmbrook School plans to introduce curriculum that decenters whiteness. Board of Education now threatens parents with law enforcement. Talk about the story.
All right. So on the decentering whiteness is, first off, you have to understand that Elmbrook is a very conservative part of Wisconsin, not even nominally conservative, but very conservative. And they have been denying that they are promoting CRT or DEI. Instead, they're using alternative language, decentering whiteness. They adamantly reject any kind of accusation that they are promoting discrimination or bigotry against white kids or heterosexual Christian male white kids in the schools. They are now the subject of attention from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty on that particular question of promoting overt discrimination. In fact, quickly an aside before we get to sort of the fresh story about Elmbrook, is the assistant superintendent there had indicated that discrimination law doesn't protect white kids, doesn't protect heterosexual kids, doesn't protect anyone who is not considered an oppressed minority. Actually claimed that federal and state discrimination law did not apply to certain groups that she finds disfavored because they are in the oppressor class.
Wait,
so a real mess going on at that school district right now.
So let me understand this. That they are not discriminating against kids who are white, but the federal Civil Rights Act allows them to. Is this the argument? That they're saying we're not discriminating against white kids, but it's totally okay if we do because the law says it's okay. Yes, exactly correct. Outstanding.
Yes. The most recent issue, and this is just a sort of a hot potato kind of school district right now. You know, a lot of parents got engaged for the first time during COVID, and good for them. What they also discovered was that highly inappropriate sexualized material was being assigned in class or was being suggested as library reading material. I mean, I think we've talked about that particular part of the story before. The latest is at Wisconsin Hills Middle School. This is in the Elmbrook School District. Inappropriate pop music lyrics are being shared with sixth grade girls, and parents have, particularly the parent of one of the girls, complained about it and been completely ignored and completely blown off. And so I'll just, quickly cut to the chase here. The song, which is every fifth word is an F-bomb practically, that was played in a classroom for a sixth grade girl. A parent read a lyric of that song at a school board meeting. That parent has now been threatened with a disorderly conduct citation. The school board indicated that it was highly inappropriate for that parent to use such language, and it set a terrible example for the children who might have been watching that school board meeting. Meanwhile, the sixth grade girls, it's totally okay for a male teacher to play those lyrics for those sixth grade girls, and it doesn't seem to violate any rules of decorum or morality.
Yeah, this is basically the F you, F this song, but it's even more sinister than that.
I have the lyrics if you'd like me to edit and read.
Michael, bleep it out. Go ahead, give us a sample.
I won't actually read I'll just say F-bomb.
All right.
F you and your mom and your sister and your job and your broke blank car and that blank you call art. F you and your friends and I'll never see again. Everybody but your dog, you can all F off. And it goes on like this. Every paragraph of the song is a F, dropping, all kinds of profanities in the song. And incidentally, I looked this up. There's actually a radio edit of this song. So there's a totally cleaned up version of this song you could have played. But the sixth grade teacher chose instead to play a song that was unedited, highly profane. And again, in something called the Lunch Bunch, this weird little private lunch group he designed for himself. with sixth grade girls. He's playing these, what I consider, and I think most adults do, highly inappropriate, profane lyrics.
Yeah, I want to flesh that out a little bit. This is not just an instance where a teacher played a song like that in front of his classroom. A male teacher who was worried about young girls in particular who didn't have somebody else to eat lunch with. So he was targeting outcast girls to become part of his lunch bunch. During lunch period, they would sit in the classroom, just them, and they would engage in behavior like the adult man playing really raucous and raunchy music for the little girls. This, my friends, is using your lunchroom, your classroom as a lunchroom to groom little girls, it seems to me.
For sure. I think so too. And I mean, I think it coined the term grooming 101. When you're talking about, how old are you in sixth grade? 12?
Yeah,
11?
about that, yep.
11 and 12 years old, I think, in sixth grade. So you're talking about kids who are fearful of and respect authority. If they are outcasts, they're going to look for someone who's going to give them approval. And he's the cool teacher who's going to play them the cool songs that their mom and dad would never tolerate having them play in the car or out loud over a speaker. So again, when the dad complains about this, nothing happened to the teacher, incidentally. Again, the quote investigation was a personnel matter, and none of the information was shared. There's no indication whether this teacher has been told he can't do this any longer, whether he's been reprimanded in any way. Instead, the dad goes to a school board meeting, reads one line of this song to the school board, and he receives a letter threatening him with prosecution for disorderly conduct because of the highly inappropriate language he used in a public meeting. The irony is so thick, you almost can't believe this.
With all the censorship taking place on social media platforms, we've made it easy to keep up with your favorite content. Simply download the Freedom Project Media app in your app store. Get access to 18 new videos a week, plus thousands of archived shows, lecture series, and educational animations. Download the Freedom Project Media app on your Apple TV, Roku, tablet, or phone, and make sure you allow for notifications to keep you informed.
All right, back with Vicki McKenna for Culture Cast. Okay, so while people in conservative Elmbrook, Wisconsin are dealing with administrators telling them that you can't discriminate against white people even if you try, we have the next phase of gender idiocy. And it's called, Vicki, I'm just going to set this up, tee it up for you, the furries. Talk about
the furries.
The furries.
Okay, let me just begin with an email I received yesterday as we were talking about various things that were going sideways in schools. I received, and kids being encouraged to declare alt gender, alt sexualities as their identities. I received this, and by the way, subsequently, I've received several emails confirming that these kinds of things are happening in schools. Hi, Vicki. I have grandchildren in the Waunakee School District. They have been instructed not to take pictures of, make fun of, stare at, or in any way call out the behavior of their classmates who are furries. The furries can choose whether they want to speak or not. The furries are allowed to dress in their choice of furry costumes. The furries can choose not to run in gym class, but instead sit at the feet of their teacher and lick their paws. Barking, hissing, and other similar animal noises are commonplace in the hallways at school. The children have been told that the furries are an identity and they must treat these children normally, and the school administration and teachers have normalized the behavior of the furries in their school. I am appalled. Now, lest you think this just might have been somebody who was trying to, punk us. Multiple parents reached out to me after I read that email on the air and said, this is real, it is happening. Kids are permitted to declare themselves furries as an identity, and they are then protected. In their behavior is protected. For those of you who don't know what a furry is, furries are people who identify with and believe in some capacity they are furry animated characters. I think most of it's typically associated with the anime world, that they are characters, animal characters in anime, and they dress up, or they put on tails, or they wear ears, or they put on whiskers, and then they pretend they're cats, and they meow, or they bark, or they growl, and they claim that at least partially, they are animals.
Well, we have
Furries.
this is way broader than you think. We have a video clip of a substitute teacher who, when she was in a classroom, she was told that when she was taking the role, one of the students meowed at her. And she says, what does that mean? And another student said, you've got to meow back at her. You've got to meow. She's a fuzzy or a furry.
Oh, I'm looking at the seating chart as I'm going up and down the rows and marking who's here and who's not. I get to the third row and I hear this meow. Excuse me? Excuse me? I start looking on the ground. Go to the fourth row, everything's good. Go to the fifth row, everybody's there. Then I hear meow. I'm like, okay, what's up with that? Who's doing it? And this little girl in the very front row says, you have to meow back at him. He identifies as a cat.
She was told by the administration she is no longer a substitute teacher there because she can't identify with all the students in her classroom.
Because she wouldn't meow back.
Right.
Okay. So I looked up, I don't know a lot about furries. I happened to bump into a furries convention once, believe it or not, only me. And it struck me as something sort of similar to Ren fairs or what that people would, fans of anime, people who would go to, say, Comic-Con, would dress up as their favorite, anime characters. I thought it was limited to that, something, fun cosplay kind of thing, a lot of like what, Ren Fair people would do. But apparently it's much deeper than that. It is considered something of a sexual fetish. If you'd like to look up what are furries, it says like any other fan interest, video games, comics, etc. There are sexual themes present, sexual activity with other furries known as yiffing. Yiffing is part of the subculture for some. Others maintain a non-erotic interest in the subject. Furries are typically subject to media portrayals that overemphasize the sexual aspect of fandom, but there is a sexual aspect of fandom. So now there's some kind of kink associated with this. We shouldn't be surprised, and it's being indulged, at least, and probably promoted.
If I decided that I was going to be a furry gorilla and black painted my face, would that be okay? Another question. If I decided...
I think we got to go to the giant abacus of oppression.
Well...
And if you've got white guy paints face black, even if he identifies as a gorilla because he's a furry, there's some kind of oppressive... overlap there that I don't think would be tolerable.
I want to see
personally.
I want to see them legislate that. I want to see a kid show up in blackface for some valid reason. Well, but if you can identify as an animal, can't you identify as black if you're white? Why couldn't four little white kids in fourth grade decide that all the praise is going to black kids? Black kids are the heroic victims. Show up in blackface. And
if I can identify as a man, why couldn't I identify as black?
If you can identify as a furry, I mean, how do they justify promoting some of that and discriminating against other that? How do they define that?
I don't think they even bothered to try.
No.
Right? So that's part of the issue. And if you think about it, you've got the indulgence and promotion of the idea that kids switch genders and then declare themselves boys if they're girls or vice versa. And I mean, biological sex is immutable. It is an immutable trait. Race is something that I suppose you could maybe make a claim it's immutable, but not really, because we cross over all the time. And so everyone's got a little bit of something in them. So I think it is far less odious in terms of the science to declare yourself a different race than it is to declare yourself a different gender.
So in other words, what you've got
is... You're not going to catch me on this.
A bunch of fascists who are rewarding what they like and punishing anybody who disagrees with them.
Of course.
All right.
It's not meant to make sense. They make the rules, they change the rules, you just are expected to keep up. And if you disagree with the rules and you do not endorse what they are promoting, that means, of course, you are a hateful neo-Nazi, Putin-supporting white supremacist.
And we end where we begin with George Orwell. Black is white is black, up is down is up. Whatever the party says is what you say.
Today's show is sponsored by our friends at MyPillow. Save up to 66% on all items at MyPillow.com when you use the code Dr. Duke. That's DRDUKE. Support this show by supporting a great American company.
Joined now by Scott Shera. Scott has a really remarkable story to tell about tragedy and compassion in the era of COVID. Scott, thank you for joining us here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Duke.
You had a very, very lovely young daughter named Grace. She seemed like just a ball of energy and enthusiasm. She was a Down syndrome child. Talk about what happened with this otherwise lovely life she was living when COVID reared its face.
So we were on the frontline doctor's protocol. We ended up in the hospital because Grace had a condition that she inherited from me that produces inflammation and clotting. So we ended up in the hospital because she needed oxygen and a steroid. I ended up in the hospital 3 days after Grace died with the same exact situation. So what happened though is once we got in, I want to jump right to the end because that's really what's important in our limited time. So Grace was improving. The last day was unfortunately the hospital ended up killing her with a combination of meds. So they had her on a med called Precedex for 4.5 days. The package insert for that med says to only use for 24 hours. They had her on it for 4.5 days. By 10:48, the morning of her last day, they ratcheted up to maximum dose. We get into the last 30 minutes of these dosages. Now she's on a max dose of Precedex. They gave her 2 doses of lorazepam at 5:46 and 5:49 back to back. And then at 6:15, they gave her the lethal dose of morphine. And they did that as an IV push. So Duke, neither of you or anybody could have survived that. We have an intensivist who has written me that said, Scott, the meds killed your daughter. And an intensivist is a doctor that has training in combination of meds. The package insert for morphine says specifically to not combine those meds because it causes death. So that combination of meds was what took Grace out, but the story gets substantially worse. And so I want people to remember this part even more than the meds, because what happened was my daughter Jessica was now an advocate in the room. I was taken out by an armed guard 3 days earlier. She was the replacement advocate. So she's in the room. Grace, after she was given the morphine, started to get cold. She wanted a nurse's help. She said, is this normal? Can you take a temperature? All the nurse did was to give her a blanket and told her that's normal. Well, it's not normal. It's normal if you want to kill somebody. And so then Jessica called Cindy and I, my wife, at 7:20, panicking. She said, Dad, Grace's numbers are dropping. I said, get the nurses in. She said, they won't come in. So we start screaming, save our daughter. Jessica estimated there's 30 nurses in the hall at this point. They would not come in that room. And so the nurses then holler back to us, she's DNR, do not resuscitate. That's the first we knew this. After the fact, we learned that the doctor put a DNR order on our daughter Grace against our wishes. I mean, what would be the reason? Grace had a great day the day before on October 12th, so much so that the doctor called us at 8 o'clock the morning of Grace's last day and wanted to put a feeding tube in to help Grace with nutrition. You know, it's crazy. Jessica found out by running in the hallway then that the doctor had put the order on. The nurse read it off the computer, and they said they couldn't do anything about it. So we watched Grace die at 7:27 on FaceTime, and if it couldn't get any worse, it does. So Jessica is telling us what's going on now after the fact, and she said, Dad, there was an armed guard posted outside the room. What's the reason? Was it to prevent a nurse who had a conscience from coming in and saving Grace? The package insert for morphine says to not combine it with those drugs, and they're supposed to have the reversal drug at bedside. They could have saved her just by choice. And so people know that the armed guard wasn't just walking by. My daughter Jessica laid with Grace in her bed after she died for 20 minutes, and that armed guard stood outside the nurse's window and watched her the whole time. So they chose to not revive our daughter. After we got to the hospital, Cindy and Jessica cleaned Grace up. I couldn't come in because I had COVID. Our pastor's walking Cindy out in a wheelchair, and one of the nurses bent down to Cindy. She had Grace's things on a cart and said, me and several of the other nurses don't think Grace should have died today.
It's a remarkable story. I mean, let me ask you quickly, were they feeding and hydrating her adequately before that last day, or were they skimping on that as well?
I believe the hydration was fine because she had a bag hooked up with water, and she had a catheter in, so things were working, but the nutrition was lacking. They prevented me from feeding Grace when I was in there. They prevented Jessica from feeding Grace when she was in there, and they only gave her a couple of protein shakes. The reality is Grace could have been fed. I challenged them because they were telling me, well, if we remove the BiPAP mask, Grace's oxygen is going to get too low, which that was not true. I watched them remove it, and they replaced it with a cannula when they would clean Grace's and swab Grace's mouth because it was getting dry. So there's absolutely no reason she couldn't have been fed regularly, and she didn't need a feeding tube at all. But we foolishly agreed to it because we didn't know at that time.
So now, since this has happened, I know that you did everything you can at the hospital to get some answers. Did they stonewall you? How has the hospital handled this with you?
Well, on November 8th, I requested a meeting with the hospital CEO and the doctor, and then we sent them all the research that we had because I believe that was my biblical responsibility. And on December 2nd, they emailed and said, we're not going to meet. They ended up writing a letter dated December 15th that we received on Christmas Eve. And they basically it was a letter of denial with all the things that I had written down, all the things that are now on Grace's website. The details of all the research are on Grace's website.
After the break, I want to come back and talk with you about what's happening now in the wake of her tragic death and what options you have, and how can people who are really touched by this story help you out. So we'll be right back in a second. All right, back again with Scott Schara. Scott, the first part of your story is really harrowing, and our prayers to you and your family. First of all, how's everybody holding up with this inexplicable loss? How's the family doing?
It's tough. I mean, I'm the spokesperson for the family, and I'm holding up mainly because God's holding me up. He doesn't fail. My wife is having an extremely hard time, as you can imagine. My daughter Jessica is. She's been my biggest supporter. She reviews everything that I talk about to make sure that I don't make a technical error because we want this information to be accurate.
Well, let's talk first about the do not resuscitate order. We know, and I talked about this at my university classes, we know in the UK, there was actually a quiet do not resuscitate order given to all Down syndrome people who came down with COVID. If they ended up in the hospital, it was nationwide, and no one even really knew about it until it came out in the news. Do you suspect there's something like this going on here? I mean, why the do not resuscitate order? Do you, to this day, do you even know how it got put there and why?
That's a great question. I mean, so do I think it happened because Grace had Down syndrome? Personally, yes, I do think that. It's going to be some time to prove it. The things happen in the UK. I think Grace's case is the first time it got caught here. So I believe there's going to be a number of these things exposed as we keep moving. The explanation for the hospital, strangely, they used the doctor's report from that day as their excuse that we approved it, and it's foolishness beyond foolishness because he wrote his report, he dictated his report at 12:57 that day, 12:57 p.m. Grace died at 7:27. So if truly we agreed to a DNR, why didn't you have us sign it? Because that's a legal requirement. A DNR order has to be signed by the patient power of attorney, which was my wife.
Are you hearing from across the country from other families who had Down syndrome COVID victims die? Have you heard? Has anybody reaching out to you?
Yeah, many. It's wonderful. Since we started the website, people are reaching out constantly. I had four reach out just yesterday, and we're updating the website with stories when they allow us to print them on the website.
So we know that the doctors collectively wouldn't talk to you, kind of cowardly. They wrote you what sounds like a form letter to me in which they pretty much denied everything that you asked about. What was the specific denial vis-a-vis the DNR?
Well, they said that the conversation that we had with the doctor the morning that Grace died, that we approved the DNR, which of course we didn't. What we talked about with the doctor was a DNI, do not intubate. they had requested for the 5th time that we give them permission to put Grace on a ventilator just in case she needed it. That was the purpose of the discussion.
For those of you who may be out of state or all across the world, this is in Wisconsin. This is taking place at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Appleton, Wisconsin. You were doing a GoFundMe campaign for this, and tell that story. So money was pouring in to help you fight this battle, and the GoFundMe people pulled the rug right out of you there. What happened then?
2 weeks ago last evening, so 2 weeks ago last Thursday, we got a unilateral email from them just saying that they stopped the GoFundMe because we had prohibited content. So basically we're spreading propaganda, and so that of course goes against the narrative, and they took it down with no right to cure or even talk to anybody. They just took it down.
What's the next step for you? How do they get a hold of more information about what's happening to you?
So ouramazinggrace.net is the website that we have. All of the research is posted there. Grace's life. We have the Give, Send, Go link on that website. So if you want to help that way, we'd love it. If you want to pray for us, that is even more important, because I'm out there every day spreading this message. The thing that we have going on specifically right now is we're working on an event outside of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a protest rally coming up on April 8th. And so we'll be spreading that word. We have a planning session this afternoon on it. Dr. Artis is flying in for that. Several other people are flying in for that to be speakers. So, I mean, that's exciting stuff.
And that's going to do it for this show. I'm Dr. Duke. Until we see you next time, stay educated, my friends.